Thank you so much for coming, and I really want to thank the Dean's Office for organizing this lecture series. They do a really outstanding job. So I'm a biologist, but I study the impacts of biological systems on the physical environment. So I actually am split half in the School of Physical Sciences and half in the School of Biological Sciences. My lab focuses on how ecosystems, especially vegetation and soil, affects the physical environment and affects climate. And there's been a lot of interest in the last few years on using biological systems to try and mitigate climate change and also adapt to climate change. So I'm actually not going to give a background into the science of climate change today. That could certainly be a talk all by itself. I'd be happy to answer any questions about the basics of climate change, but I want to come at this from a slightly different perspective. So I'm going to talk today literally about your backyard, the backyard of your house. And I have seen for about the past 10 years or so a lot of advice out there on what you should do with your backyard to help the environment. A lot of people will tell you that you should plant trees, right? Trees are very good. When we plant trees, all kinds of great things happen. At the same time, people will tell you to xeriscape and to use less water. They might also tell you to grow some food in your backyard and to plant native plants in your backyard. And you cannot do all of these things simultaneously. So some of this advice is conflicting, actually. And a few years ago, we decided to look into the scientific literature to see which of these methods has been scientifically tested in terms of truly impacting the environment in a positive way. So if you xeriscape, for example, how much water do you actually save? Or if you plant trees, how much carbon do you actually sequester? How much CO2 do you remove from the atmosphere? And we found that there had been very little scientific research into verifying these methods of helping the environment. And we have very, very good methods right now in ecological science to test these approaches. So we started to do that in my lab. So I'm going to talk today both about climate mitigation and adaptation. Those are words that are used a lot these days, and I'll explain what they mean. So, of course, the reason why we are experiencing climate change is because the concentration of carbon dioxide has been increasing in the atmosphere post-industrial revolution due to the burning of fossil fuels. Mitigation of climate change is avoidance of climate change. So the way that we would mitigate climate change is to either emit less CO2 or to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. And that way we can just avoid climate change altogether. Now I can tell you right now that that's a very worthy goal, but we're not going to make it. So there's no way that CO2 emissions are going to go to zero. So we need to look at mitigation options, but at the same time that we do that, we have to look at adaptation options. And adaptation is coping with the climate change that is unavoidable. So climate change is mostly associated with temperature, global warming. When you hear about climate change, people are often talking about global warming. But it's very difficult to predict local impacts of climate change. We know that the average temperature on Earth is increasing and will continue to increase. We want to know what's going to happen here in Southern California. That's normally very difficult to predict, but in California there's a very robust prediction that one of the major impacts of climate change for us is going to be a decline in water availability. So this graph is showing the decline in snowpack that's already happened in the 20th century. So here, where the colors are warm, the red colors are showing a decline in snowpack from 1949 to 2004. Snowpack is declining, and it's very likely that that's going to continue. Snowpack is our water source here in Irvine. When you turn on the tap, most of that water comes from snowmelt. So one of the changes that we are probably going to have to cope with, no matter what, is going to be a decline in water availability. And that coping mechanism is called adaptation.